The revelation came through the most unexpected source, a marriage that everyone, including me, considered a model of Christian excellence. Mark and Sarah Henderson had been married for 15 years, served together in ministry, raised 3 beautiful children, and seemed to embody everything the church taught about godly relationships. They were the couple other believers pointed to as proof that biblical marriage actually worked. As a single man who had spent years studying relationships and counseling couples, I had known the Hendersons for over a decade, had spoken at their church multiple times, and had even used their relationship as an example in my marriage seminars. Mark was a successful businessman who treated his wife with obvious respect and affection. Sarah was a devoted mother who spoke of her husband with genuine admiration. They prayed together, served together, and never displayed even a hint of the conflicts that plagued so many Christian marriages. That's why the phone call from Sarah at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday night in November shocked me to my core. "Jonathan," she said, her voice breaking with a pain I had never heard from her before, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to promise me you won't try to fix it or give me advice. Mark and I are separating. We're probably getting divorced." I sat up in bed, completely stunned. "Sarah, what happened? You two seemed so happy just last month when I saw you at the conference." "That's just it," she replied, her voice filled with a mixture of exhaustion and revelation. "We did seem happy. We've seemed happy for years. But Jonathan, we've been living a lie. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but we've been committing a sin that's been slowly destroying our marriage from the inside, and we didn't even know it was happening." "What sin?" I asked, my mind racing through possibilities. "Sarah, whatever it is, surely it can be worked through. You two love each other. You've built a life together." "We do love each other," she said, "but we've never actually known each other. We've been married for 15 years, and we're complete strangers. We've been so focused on being the perfect Christian couple that we never learned to be real with each other. We've been committing the sin of emotional dishonesty, and it's killed our marriage." After she hung up, I lay awake for hours trying to process what she had told me. Mark and Sarah's marriage had been destroyed not by adultery, not by abuse, not by addiction, but by something far more subtle and, according to Sarah, far more common in Christian marriages than anyone wanted to admit. Over the following weeks, as I watched their separation unfold, I began to see what Sarah meant. Despite their obvious love and mutual respect, Mark and Sarah had never developed genuine emotional intimacy. They had learned to be good Christian spouses without ever learning to be authentic human beings with each other. Mark had spent 15 years being the spiritual leader he thought he should be, rather than the man he actually was. Sarah had spent 15 years being the supportive wife she thought she should be rather than the woman she actually was. They had performed their roles perfectly while their souls remained unknown to each other. "We never fought," Sarah explained to me during one of our conversations, "because we never disagreed about anything important, but we never disagreed because we never shared anything important. We talked about schedules and children and ministry, but we never talked about our fears, our dreams, our struggles, or our real thoughts about anything that mattered." The more I learned about their situation, the more I realized that what had destroyed their marriage wasn't unique to them. As I began paying closer attention to other Christian couples I counseled, I started seeing the same pattern everywhere: marriages that looked successful on the surface but lacked genuine emotional connection underneath. These couples had learned to be good Christians together without learning to be real people together. They had mastered the external behaviors that churches taught about marriage while never developing the internal intimacy that made marriage actually work. As a single man who had spent years observing marriages from the outside, I found myself in a unique position to see patterns that married people might miss. I had counseled hundreds of couples, studied thousands of relationships, and watched the same destructive patterns repeat themselves in marriage after marriage, regardless of how committed or well-intentioned the spouses were. 3 months after Sarah's phone call, as I was preparing for a speaking engagement about relationships, I found myself desperately needing answers that went beyond conventional marriage advice. The standard Christian teaching about roles, communication techniques, and conflict resolution seemed inadequate to address what I was seeing in marriage after marriage. That night, alone in my study, I found myself on my knees in prayer with an urgency I hadn't felt since my encounters with Jesus about the rapture and divine judgment. "Lord," I whispered, I'm seeing marriages destroyed by something that no one is talking about, something that might be more dangerous than the sins we warn couples about. I need to understand what's really destroying Christian marriages, and I need to know what you want me to tell people about it. The study grew quiet in that familiar way that preceded Jesus' appearances. But this time, instead of his immediate presence, I felt compelled to think about all the marriages I had observed over the years, about the patterns I had seen repeated in couple after couple who genuinely loved each other but somehow remained strangers. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Sarah was right. The hidden sin destroying marriages wasn't just their problem, it was epidemic in the Christian community, and it was far more dangerous than anyone realized because it masqueraded as spiritual maturity. Suddenly, my study filled with that familiar presence, and Jesus was sitting in the chair across from my desk, his expression more serious than I had ever seen before. But there was also something else in his eyes, a deep sadness, as if he had been watching this destruction happen in marriage after marriage while his people remained oblivious to the real cause. "Jonathan," he said, his voice carrying both infinite compassion and profound concern, "your unique perspective as someone who has observed marriages without being in one has allowed you to see what many married people miss. You've identified the hidden sin that's destroying more Christian marriages than adultery, abuse, and addiction combined. Tonight, I'm going to show you what this sin really is, why it's so prevalent in the church, and why most believers don't even recognize it as sin." Before I could respond, my study around us dissolved. We were observing what appeared to be the most intimate view of marriage relationships I had ever witnessed, not just the external interactions that people could see, but the internal realities that determined whether marriages thrived or slowly died from the inside out. The hidden sin, Jesus explained, is not emotional dishonesty, though that's part of it. The hidden sin is emotional cowardice, the refusal to risk genuine vulnerability for the sake of authentic intimacy. It's the choice to be safe rather than real, to be acceptable rather than known. What I witnessed next shattered my understanding of what was really happening in Christian marriages. Jesus showed me that countless couples who appeared to have strong relationships were actually living as emotional strangers, connected by shared activities and mutual respect, but separated by walls of self-protection that prevented genuine intimacy. This sin, Jesus continued, is particularly prevalent among Christians because the church has often taught people to be good spouses without teaching them to be authentic human beings. They've learned to perform their roles correctly while keeping their souls hidden from the very person they've promised to share their lives with. I watched as this pattern played out in marriage after marriage. Husbands who had learned to be spiritual leaders without ever sharing their fears, doubts, or struggles. Wives who had learned to be supportive partners without ever expressing their real thoughts, feelings, or desires. Couples who prayed together, served together, and raised children together while remaining essentially unknown to each other. The shocking truth, Jesus said, is that this emotional cowardice feels like wisdom to those who practice it. They believe they're protecting their marriages by avoiding conflict, maintaining harmony, and focusing on positive interactions. But they're actually starving their marriages of the vulnerability that creates genuine intimacy. The vision expanded to show me how this hidden sin operated in practical terms. I saw couples who never fought because they never shared anything worth fighting about. I saw spouses who never hurt each other's feelings because they never revealed feelings that could be hurt. I saw marriages that looked peaceful because they had eliminated the very vulnerability that could create either deep pain or deep connection. This sin is hidden, Jesus explained, because it masquerades as spiritual maturity. These couples appear to have overcome selfishness, pride, and conflict, but they've actually avoided the very challenges that would force them to grow in love, understanding, and genuine intimacy. As the vision continued, I began to see the devastating long-term effects of this emotional cowardice. Marriages that slowly grew cold despite the absence of major problems. Couples who drifted apart while maintaining all the external forms of connection. Spouses who felt increasingly lonely while living with someone who loved them but didn't really know them. The most shocking aspect of this sin, Jesus said, is that it often destroys the best marriages, the ones where both spouses are genuinely good people, who truly love each other, but have never learned to risk the vulnerability that would allow them to actually know each other. I thought of Mark and Sarah, and suddenly their situation made perfect sense. They hadn't failed at being good Christian spouses, they had succeeded at it so well that they had never learned to be real human beings with each other. But Lord, I asked, my heart racing as I considered the implications, if this sin is so hidden and feels so much like wisdom, how can couples recognize it in their own marriages? How can they know whether they're building genuine intimacy or just maintaining the appearance of a good relationship? That's what I'll show you tomorrow night, Jesus replied, his expression mixing divine love with urgent concern. Meet me where you first learn the difference between observing relationships and understanding them. There, I will reveal how couples can recognize this hidden sin in their own relationships and what it takes to move from emotional safety to authentic intimacy. As his presence began to fade, his final words burned themselves into my consciousness. Tell them that the sin destroying their marriages is not the one they're watching for. Tell them that emotional cowardice feels like wisdom but produces death. Tell them that the marriages that look the most successful are often the ones in the greatest danger. And then I was alone in my study, but everything had changed. The comfortable assumptions about what made Christian marriages work lay in ruins around me. The hidden sin wasn't dramatic or obvious, it was subtle, respectable, and often praised as spiritual maturity. But according to Jesus, it was destroying more marriages than all the sins the church warned couples about combined. Mark and Sarah's marriage hadn't been destroyed by a failure to follow biblical principles. It had been destroyed by following those principles without ever learning to risk the vulnerability that would make those principles meaningful. They had been good Christian spouses while remaining strangers to each other, and that emotional cowardice had slowly killed the very relationship they were trying to protect. But Jesus' revelation had raised even more disturbing questions. If this hidden sin was so prevalent in Christian marriages, and if it felt so much like wisdom to those who practiced it, how many other couples were slowly destroying their relationships while believing they were building them? How could spouses learn to distinguish between genuine intimacy and the mere appearance of connection? And most importantly, what would it take to move from the safety of emotional distance to the risk of authentic vulnerability? The second night brought revelations that shattered my understanding of what intimacy actually meant in marriage. After Jesus revealed that emotional cowardice was the hidden sin destroying Christian marriages, I couldn't stop thinking about how many couples I had counseled who seemed close but might actually be strangers living under the same roof. As instructed, I drove to a small lakeside retreat center, where I had first begun to understand the difference between observing marriages and truly comprehending them. It was during a marriage-intensive weekend there, where I had served as a counselor and observer, that I had witnessed couples breaking through years of polite distance to risk real vulnerability with each other. The weekend had been transformational for the participants and eye-opening for me as I watched the difference between performing marriage roles and sharing souls. The retreat center was quiet in the evening darkness, with only the sound of gentle waves lapping against the shore. I sat on the same dock where I had watched couple after couple finally move beyond surface-level sharing to risk authentic vulnerability with each other. It was there that I had learned the terrifying but liberating truth that genuine intimacy required the courage to be known rather than just the skill to be liked. As I settled onto the wooden bench at the end of the dock, I felt the familiar deepening of reality that preceded Jesus' appearances. The lake seemed to glow with an inner light, and then Jesus was sitting beside me on the bench, his presence both utterly peaceful and completely penetrating. "This is where you first learned that intimacy and compatibility are not the same thing," he said, his voice carrying across the water with gentle authority. "Your perspective as someone who has studied marriages from the outside has given you unique insights into patterns that married people often can't see. Tonight, I'm going to show you how couples can recognize the hidden sin of emotional cowardice in their own relationships, and what the difference is between genuine intimacy and the counterfeit that so many Christian marriages settle for." Before I could respond, the retreat center around us dissolved. We were observing what appeared to be the most intimate view of marriage relationships I had ever witnessed, not just what couples said and did, but what they felt, feared, and carefully avoided sharing with each other. "The shocking truth," Jesus explained, "is that most Christian couples have learned to create the appearance of intimacy without ever experiencing the reality of it. They've developed what I call counterfeit intimacy, a connection that feels real but lacks the vulnerability that makes intimacy transformational." What I witnessed next revolutionized my understanding of what was really happening in Christian marriages. Jesus showed me that there were actually 3 distinct levels of marital connection, and that most couples stopped at the second level, mistaking it for genuine intimacy. The first level, Jesus said, is surface compatibility. Couples at this level get along well, share common interests, and rarely conflict because they rarely share anything deep enough to create disagreement. They're comfortable together, but they don't really know each other. I watched as this played out in countless marriages I had observed over the years. Couples who could spend hours together talking about schedules, children, work, and activities while never sharing their fears, dreams, struggles, or authentic thoughts about anything that mattered to their souls. They were pleasant companions, but emotional strangers. These couples, Jesus explained, often think they have good marriages because they don't fight, they enjoy each other's company, and they function well as a team. But they've never moved beyond the safety of surface-level connection. The second level, Jesus continued, is emotional compatibility. Couples at this level share more of their thoughts and feelings, support each other through difficulties, and create a sense of partnership that feels like genuine intimacy. This is where most Christian marriages stop, and where the counterfeit becomes most deceptive. The vision expanded to show me couples I had counseled who had learned to share their emotions, communicate about their needs, and support each other through life's challenges. They felt close, connected, and satisfied with their relationships. They had what most marriage books and seminars taught as the goal of Christian marriage. But even this level, Jesus said, can be a form of emotional cowardice if couples are only sharing the emotions and thoughts that feel safe, that won't threaten their image of themselves or their spouse's image of them. I watched as couples at this level carefully edited what they shared, unconsciously avoiding the thoughts, feelings, fears, and desires that might create conflict, disappointment, or rejection. They were emotionally connected, but only within carefully maintained boundaries that protected them from genuine vulnerability. This counterfeit intimacy, Jesus explained, feels real to those who experience it because it's so much deeper than surface compatibility. These couples genuinely care for each other, understand each other's personalities, and provide emotional support. But they're still protecting themselves from the level of vulnerability that creates transformational intimacy. The third level, Jesus said, is soul intimacy. This is where couples risk sharing not just their comfortable emotions, but their uncomfortable truths, their fears, their failures, their doubts, their struggles, and the parts of themselves they're not proud of. The vision shifted to show me couples who had learned to be completely authentic with each other, sharing not just their strengths but their weaknesses, not just their victories but their failures, not just their faith but their doubts. These couples fought more than those at the second level, but they also loved more deeply. Soul intimacy, Jesus explained, requires the courage to be known rather than just liked, to be authentic rather than just acceptable. It means sharing the parts of yourself that might disappoint your spouse, challenge their image of you, or create conflict that has to be worked through. What struck me most was that couples at this level didn't have fewer problems, they had more honest conversations about their problems. They didn't have less conflict, they had more productive conflict because they were dealing with real issues rather than surface symptoms. The hidden sin of emotional cowardice, Jesus said, keeps couples trapped at the second level, mistaking emotional compatibility for soul intimacy. They feel close enough to be satisfied, but not vulnerable enough to be transformed. I began to understand why this sin was so hidden and so dangerous. Couples practicing emotional cowardice weren't obviously dysfunctional, they were often the marriages that others admired and wanted to emulate. They had learned to create connection without risking the vulnerability that would make that connection transformational. But how can couples recognize whether they have genuine intimacy or just the counterfeit? I asked, thinking of all the marriages I had counseled that I had considered successful, but might actually be stuck at the second level. The test, Jesus replied, is found in examining what you don't share with your spouse and why you don't share it. Genuine intimacy means there are no areas of your soul that are off limits because they might threaten your spouse's image of you or your image of yourself. What followed was the most penetrating examination of marital intimacy I had ever experienced. Jesus showed me how to distinguish between the vulnerability that creates genuine intimacy and the emotional sharing that creates only the appearance of intimacy. Couples with counterfeit intimacy, Jesus explained, share their emotions but edit their thoughts. They express their feelings but hide their fears. They communicate their needs but conceal their struggles. They're emotionally connected but spiritually separate. I watched as this pattern played out in marriage after marriage I had observed. Husbands who shared their work stress but hid their spiritual doubts. Wives who expressed their feelings about the children but concealed their disappointments about the marriage. Couples who prayed together about external challenges but never shared their internal struggles. The shocking truth, Jesus continued, is that this emotional editing feels like wisdom and maturity. These couples believe they're protecting their marriages by avoiding unnecessary conflict and maintaining positive connections, but they're actually preventing the very vulnerability that would allow their love to transform them. The vision expanded to show me how this counterfeit intimacy affected couples over time. Initially, the emotional connection felt satisfying and deep, but gradually, as the unshared parts of their souls grew larger, they began to feel increasingly lonely even while living with someone who loved them. This is why, Jesus explained, couples like Mark and Sarah can love each other deeply while remaining strangers. They've learned to connect emotionally while avoiding the soul-level vulnerability that would allow them to actually know each other. I began to see that the problem wasn't a lack of love or commitment. It was a lack of courage to risk the kind of vulnerability that would make love transformational rather than just comfortable. The counterfeit feels safer, Jesus said, because it provides connection without requiring the courage to be completely known. But it ultimately produces loneliness because the parts of yourself that you don't share with your spouse remain isolated and unknown. As the vision continued, I could see how this hidden sin affected not just the couples themselves, but their children, their ministries, and their witness to the world. Marriages built on counterfeit intimacy look successful but lack the transformational power that genuine soul intimacy created. Children raised in these homes, Jesus explained, learn to be good people without learning to be real people. They master the art of emotional editing, carrying this pattern into their own relationships and perpetuating the cycle of counterfeit intimacy. The implications were staggering. If emotional cowardice was epidemic in Christian marriages, and if it felt so much like wisdom to those who practiced it, then entire generations of believers were learning to relate to others through carefully maintained emotional distance rather than genuine vulnerability. But Lord, I asked, my heart racing as I considered what this meant for my counseling, ministry, and the couples I worked with. If counterfeit intimacy feels so satisfying and looks so successful, what motivates couples to risk the vulnerability that genuine intimacy requires? That's what I'll show you tomorrow night, Jesus replied, his expression mixing infinite compassion with transforming challenge. Meet me where you first learned that understanding marriage from the outside can sometimes provide clearer vision than experiencing it from the inside. There I will reveal what it takes to move from counterfeit intimacy to soul intimacy, and why that movement is essential not just for marriage but for spiritual growth itself. As his presence began to fade, his final words burned themselves into my consciousness. Tell them that the intimacy they think they have may be the very thing preventing the intimacy they actually need. Tell them that emotional safety can become spiritual stagnation. Tell them that the courage to be completely known is the pathway to being completely loved. And then I was alone on the dock, but everything had changed. The comfortable assumptions about what constituted a good Christian marriage lay in ruins around me. Counterfeit intimacy wasn't just a relationship problem, it was a spiritual problem that affected every area of life. And according to Jesus, learning to distinguish between genuine and counterfeit intimacy was essential not just for marital success, but for spiritual transformation itself. As a single man who had spent years studying marriages from the outside, I realized that my unique perspective had allowed me to see patterns that married people often missed. But now I understood that this insight came with a responsibility to help couples recognize the difference between the intimacy they thought they had and the intimacy they actually needed. The third night brought the most challenging and transformational revelation about marriage I had ever received. Jesus had shown me that emotional cowardice was destroying Christian marriages by creating counterfeit intimacy that felt satisfying but lacked the vulnerability necessary for genuine transformation. Now I needed to understand what it actually took to move from safety to authenticity, from emotional compatibility to soul intimacy. As instructed, I drove to a small mountain cabin that served as a retreat center where I had witnessed the most profound marriage transformation of my counseling career. It was there, during a weekend intensive that I had watched a couple on the brink of divorce discover the courage to share the parts of themselves they had been hiding, not just from each other, but from themselves. The cabin sat on a ridge overlooking a vast valley, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to whisper secrets in the mountain wind. I sat on the same porch where I had watched David and Lisa Morrison finally break through years of careful emotional editing to risk complete vulnerability with each other. It was there that I had learned the terrifying but liberating truth that being completely known was the only pathway to being completely loved. As I settled into the wooden rocking chair where that breakthrough had occurred, I felt the familiar thickening of the atmosphere that preceded Jesus' appearances. The valley below seemed to glow with an inner light, and then Jesus was sitting in the chair beside me, his presence both utterly gentle and completely transforming. This is where you first witness the transformation that occurs when couples find the courage to move from emotional safety to authentic vulnerability, he said, his voice carrying across the mountain silence with tender authority. Your unique perspective as someone who has observed this process from the outside has given you insights that many married people never gain. Tonight, I'm going to show you what it takes to move from counterfeit intimacy to soul intimacy, and why that movement is essential not just for marriage, but for spiritual growth itself. Before I could respond, the mountain cabin around us dissolved. We were observing what appeared to be the most intimate view of transformation I had ever witnessed, not just the external process of improving relationships, but the internal journey from self-protection to authentic vulnerability. The movement from counterfeit to genuine intimacy, Jesus explained, requires understanding that vulnerability is not just a relationship skill, it's a spiritual discipline. Learning to be completely known by another person is practice for learning to be completely known by me. What I witnessed next revolutionized my understanding of why genuine intimacy was so difficult and so essential. Jesus showed me that the emotional cowardice destroying marriages was actually a symptom of a deeper spiritual problem, the fear of being fully known by anyone, including God. The shocking truth, Jesus said, is that people who cannot risk complete vulnerability with another human being will never experience complete intimacy with me. The walls they build to protect themselves from human judgment also protect them from my transforming love. I watched as this principle played out in the spiritual lives of countless believers. Those who practiced emotional editing in their relationships also practiced spiritual editing in their relationship with God, sharing their acceptable thoughts and feelings while hiding their doubts, struggles, and failures. This is why, Jesus explained, learning to be completely authentic in human relationships is not just about improving those relationships, it's about removing the barriers that prevent genuine intimacy with me. The vision expanded to show me the barriers then. Specific steps that moved couples from counterfeit intimacy to soul intimacy, and how each step was simultaneously a movement toward deeper spiritual authenticity. The first step, Jesus said, is recognizing that emotional safety can become spiritual stagnation. Couples must understand that the comfort they feel in their current level of connection may actually be preventing the growth that genuine intimacy would produce. I watched as couples who had been satisfied with their emotional compatibility began to recognize that their careful editing was keeping them from experiencing the transformational power of complete vulnerability. This recognition created a holy dissatisfaction with relationships that felt good but weren't producing growth. This recognition, Jesus explained, is crucial because it creates the motivation necessary for the risk that genuine intimacy requires. Couples who are satisfied with counterfeit intimacy will never take the risks that authentic intimacy demands. The second step, Jesus continued, is learning to identify and share the thoughts, feelings, and experiences you've been editing out of your relationship. This means examining not just what you do share with your spouse, but what you don't share and why you don't share it. The vision shifted to show me couples who began to examine their patterns of emotional editing. They discovered they had been hiding their spiritual doubts, their disappointments about the marriage, their fears about the future, their struggles with sin, and their authentic thoughts about everything from parenting to ministry. This examination, Jesus explained, often reveals that couples have been sharing their emotions while hiding their thoughts, expressing their feelings while concealing their fears, communicating their needs while protecting their vulnerabilities. The third step, Jesus said, is developing the courage to share one authentic vulnerability at a time. Genuine intimacy is not built through dramatic revelations but through consistent choices to risk being known in small but significant ways. I watched as couples learned to gradually expand their vulnerability, sharing one hidden thought or feeling at a time, a husband finally admitting his spiritual doubts, a wife expressing her disappointment about their physical intimacy, a couple discussing their real fears about their children's futures. Each act of authentic vulnerability, Jesus explained, creates the safety necessary for the next level of sharing. Couples learn that being known doesn't destroy love, it deepens it. The fourth step, Jesus continued, is learning to receive your spouse's vulnerability without judgment, defensiveness, or attempts to fix them. Genuine intimacy requires not just the courage to be known, but the maturity to know your spouse completely. The vision expanded to show me how couples learn to create safety for each other's authenticity. Instead of responding to vulnerable sharing with advice, criticism, or emotional reactivity, they learn to respond with curiosity, compassion, and acceptance. This receiving of vulnerability, Jesus explained, is often more difficult than sharing vulnerability. It requires the spiritual maturity to love your spouse as they actually are, rather than as you wish they were. The fifth step, Jesus said, is understanding that genuine intimacy will create conflict that must be worked through rather than avoided. Soul intimacy means dealing with real differences rather than maintaining artificial harmony. I watched as couples who moved to authentic vulnerability discovered that they disagreed about more things than they had realized. But instead of avoiding these conflicts, they learned to work through them in ways that increased understanding and deepened connection. This conflict, Jesus explained, is not a sign that intimacy is failing, it's evidence that intimacy is working. Couples who never fight are usually couples who never share anything worth fighting about. As the vision continued, I could see how these steps worked together to create marriages that were not just successful but transformational relationships that changed both spouses into more authentic, loving, and spiritually mature people. The ultimate goal, Jesus said, is not just a better marriage but transformation into the people I created you to be. Genuine intimacy between spouses becomes a pathway to genuine intimacy with me. As the vision began to fade and the mountain cabin gradually reappeared around us, Jesus turned to face me directly, his eyes filled with both infinite love and transforming challenge. "Jonathan," he said, "your calling as someone who observes marriages from the outside is to help couples see what they cannot see from the inside. The hidden sin destroying marriages is not just about relationships, it's about spiritual growth. Couples who learn to risk complete vulnerability with each other are learning to risk complete vulnerability with me. The courage to be completely known by another person," he continued, "develops the courage to be completely known by me. The safety couples create for each other's authenticity teaches them to trust in my acceptance of their authenticity." As his presence began to intensify rather than fade, I realized this wasn't just information he was sharing, it was an invitation he was extending to every couple willing to move beyond the safety of counterfeit intimacy to the transformation of genuine vulnerability. "Right now," Jesus said, "any couple can begin the journey from emotional cowardice to authentic intimacy. They can stop protecting themselves from being known and start risking the vulnerability that creates genuine love." In that moment, sitting in the same chair where I had witnessed the Morrisons' marriage transformation, I felt the weight of my calling as a counselor and teacher settling on my shoulders with new clarity. The hidden sin wasn't just destroying marriages, it was limiting people's ability to experience the fullness of relationship with God. "Your unique perspective," Jesus said, "allows you to see patterns that married people often miss because they're too close to their own situations. Use this gift to help them recognize the difference between the intimacy they think they have and the intimacy they actually need." As a single man who had spent years studying relationships from the outside, I realized that my singleness wasn't a limitation in understanding marriage, it was actually an advantage that allowed me to see clearly what couples often couldn't see from within their own relationships. "The question," Jesus said as his presence filled the mountain air with transforming light, "is not whether someone's marriage looks successful. It's whether their marriage is producing the spiritual growth that genuine intimacy makes possible." As his presence finally began to fade, his final words burned themselves into my consciousness. "Tell them that the sin destroying their marriages is the refusal to risk being completely known."
Thank you so much for watching this message all the way to the end. We truly appreciate you being part of this community of faith. If this video encouraged, inspired, or challenged your heart in any way, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss future messages. We'd also love to hear from you. Share your thoughts, favorite Bible verse, or prayer request in the comments below. Our community enjoys encouraging one another and praying together. May the Lord bless you, strengthen your faith, and fill your heart with His peace until we meet again in the next video. God bless you.
Tell them that emotional safety can become spiritual stagnation. Tell them that the courage to be vulnerable with their spouse is practice for being vulnerable with me. And tell them that genuine intimacy is not just about having a better marriage, it's about becoming the people I created them to be. For months now, this shocking truth has revolutionized my understanding of marriage and spiritual growth. The hidden sin destroying Christian marriages is not adultery, abuse, or addiction. It's the emotional cowardice that prevents couples from risking the vulnerability that genuine intimacy requires. This sin is hidden because it masquerades as wisdom, maturity, and spiritual success. Couples practicing emotional cowardice often have marriages that look exemplary while lacking the authentic connection that makes marriage transformational. The shocking truth is that learning to be completely known by another person is essential preparation for being completely known by God. The walls we build to protect ourselves from human judgment also protect us from divine transformation. But the most shocking revelation is that this hidden sin is completely unnecessary. Any couple willing to move beyond the safety of counterfeit intimacy can experience the transformation that genuine vulnerability creates. The same courage that risks being completely known by another person develops the courage to be completely known by God. The hidden sin destroying marriages is not about what couples are doing wrong, it's about what they're not risking at all. And that risk, according to Jesus, is not just essential for marital success, it's essential for spiritual growth itself.